We are an application integration solution purpose-built for social impact organizations and institutions that enables them to build ecosystems of best-in-class technology, right, to ultimately drive their productivity, thereby their operating leverage, and thus their mission impact. There is a model called entrepreneurship through acquisition, or ETA, right? And I thought that model made a lot of sense for me when I first embarked on the actual journey through entrepreneurship through acquisition, right? So I'm an entrepreneur at heart, right? I love the strategy, the excitement, right? The shifting environments, right? The speed at which entrepreneurs have to move. So that excites me, right? And I love the fulfillment of essentially seeing something that you can use a strategy essentially to grow your business. I came to an understanding as I was essentially operating Omatic where a nonprofit would be asking their constituent, their supporter, their donor to reach into their hearts, thereby their wallets, to be able to drive their mission and impact their mission. So the utility that supporter receives, the benefit that they're receiving actually is an emotion, right? Because it's indeed an act of altruism. So the data that's held within any system of record or application represents that emotion, that person, right? So ultimately the data that's held within the system should be treated with the utmost respect. And what I've found, right, as talking to customers, is that the data is the lifeblood of that organization ultimately as they drive their missions, right? So to make a mistake with that data, right, and a mistake could be essentially an error made in the donation that was provided, right? Not being able to communicate them at meaningful levels, right? Having a fragmented process where ultimately you do not have a 360-degree view of support, or not having the information in real time, all impacts essentially the ability to operate, right? So let's suppose the individuals that are working at the actual nonprofit are now trying to get data into a system, out of the system, to be able to, so for the fundraiser to be able to use and engage the constituents at meaningful levels, right? If there's broken processes along the way that they may or may not even recognize, right? That inhibits their ability essentially to engage that constituent, or the mistake actually diminishes and deteriorates that benefit, that utility that supporter, that donor is getting. So ultimately what happens is that because it's so emotional, right, if ultimately that emotion is diminished, right, then they might take their hard-earned dollars to essentially another nonprofit, or something else that they're essentially they're passionate about. The outcomes, right, that we're expecting essentially from the nonprofit is to drive the mission, right? It's not essentially to drive their expenses lower, right, or essentially to reduce their costs, right? So if their ability to drive the mission comes to essentially the form of money, then they should be investing in the thing that ultimately drives, let's say, the revenue, right? Makes their expenses more efficient, ultimately through the productivity of the actual people working for the nonprofit. And ultimately over a period of time, essentially the slope of revenue steepens, essentially why the slope of essentially expenses decreases. And ultimately that is the definition of operating leverage. And ultimately if that represents essentially your ability to impact your mission, right, then ultimately through that leverage, through the investments in adoption and technology, and tying that technology together, ultimately to give you a great set of data, and healthy actually set of data that you can leverage, so you can extract value out of your mission-driven data as rapidly as possible, right, ultimately enables you to essentially stretch that leverage, or essentially grow that leverage, which ultimately translates into mission impact.